as I say, what we're going to look at this evening, and I've titled it FTP Myth or Reality, but it's really about how we get you more out of your training. But I want to look at the idea of using power, so therefore talking about threshold power, functional threshold power. However, if you're a runner and don't use power, or if you're a cyclist or a triathlete and don't use power, don't feel put off and feel that you need to leave immediately at this point, because there will be a lot here for you this evening. So I want to start off by just reminding those of you that don't know me, I was really lucky and fortunate to do my PhD in glorious Cape Town with Professor Tim Noakes. I think I'm just trying to think when I left. I probably left there. I think I got there in about 92 and left in about 95. So I spent a good few years in glorious Cape Town. And this is the picture that's often painted on those lovely holiday brochures that you see advertising South Africa and Cape Town, the lovely view of Table Mountain. And somewhere, and I'm just trying to work out, I think around the other side of the mountain around there was where University of Cape Town was. Great place to be. But sometimes pictures are deceptive. So is Cape Town really that glorious? Is it actually what we make it to be? These are, for those of you, again, who have been lucky enough, fortunate enough to visit Cape Town, these are the shanty towns that surround Cape Town. So you can still see Table Mountain in the background. And if I use my mouse at this point, University of Cape Town is probably somewhere around this point in the mountain. And you land at, I can't remember the name of the airport anymore. It changes its name so often. And you basically drive in the freeway. And as you're looking left and right all the way down the freeway, you are surrounded by these shanty towns. And there are a lot of people that live there who don't have it as fortunate as us. And so, we look at that situation going, don't just take a picture by its first image. Don't just think, FTP is all it should be. Because someone sold you the dream, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is the dream. So let's just have a brief, this is me. I'm not going to go into who I am. Background, exercise science, PhD, exercise physiology, loads of years of teaching sports science. And then for the last 17 years, been running Sportstest. Again, hopefully a few of you made my seminar last week. If you didn't, again, it will be on YouTube. So if you flick back to the Facebook pages, Sportstest Facebook pages, you'll be able to find a link there. Send us a personal message. And it's worthwhile having a look, because I spoke about all the things, all the aspects we need to think about really before we look at training. The crucial thing for me this evening, though, is looking at your performance. And this is really what training is all about. This is really why we need to think about power. We need to think about pace. We need to think about heart rate. We need to think about rate of perceived exertion. And really, what is the best model that we should be using? And if we think about our body here as this example of high performance vehicle, the crucial thing up here is engine size, type, and tuning. If you've not got the right engine for the job, or you've not done the right type of training for the job and it's not tuned appropriately, you're not going to get the performance that you desire. So, there's no point in going to the velodrome and doing loads and loads of sprint races if you're planning to go out and ride a 200-kilometre sportive ride. Likewise, if you're looking to time trial and, blitz up and down a dual carriageway every weekend, racing a 10-mile time trial, to a certain extent, there's no point in going out and doing 5-6 hour training rides. So we've got to tweak the engine to make sure that we get the most from your physiology. And I'm just jumping through these slides really quickly. So at this point, I say to my athletes, well, what are we going to use in terms of training zones? And so I would question, well, why are you going to use heart rate? Why are you going to use power output? And for the runners out there, why are you going to use pace or perceived exertion? So the focus is, why are we looking at these metrics? And quite sadly, and I will say it's very sadly, it's because the pros do. This was a training camp that I led back in 2001. I led a Sportstest training camp back in 2001, and we were down the road in Denia, and the Radio Shack team were training just out of Benidorm. So we jumped in the car and went down to see them at their training camp. And, this is an image that I picked up of the guys as they were just about to go out on the road. And at this, you can clearly see here with this rider, he has got polar heart rate monitor on his wrist, and he's got his SRM head units on his bike. Now, it still baffles me a little bit because, in these days, if we look at it, he should have a polar chest strap on, which would obviously talk to his monitor. But actually, the SRM head unit will pick up heart rate from here as well. So you sort of wonder why he's looking at 2 sets of data. Now, if you're anything like me, and I've got my Garmin on here now, this lives on my wrist 24 hours a day. So, it might be that, and at this stage, Polars didn't do this, you needed to have that chest strap on, but, it might be that this athlete was using the heart rate monitor for more than just his training sessions. So, it can be useful to look at resting heart rate in the morning. It can be useful to look at sort of whole body overview of what's going on as the day goes on, to give us a really better understanding of how your body is coping to those training sessions. But, the problem is why do people go out and buy these things? Why do you go and spend 500 to, several £1,000s on a power meter? Why do you go out and spend 30 quid to £600-700 on a heart rate monitor? Well, the pros do. We need to understand why we're doing it and what we actually get from using these systems. And it boils down again, and I say this time and time and time again, it boils down to you fully understanding your priorities. And the point that I wanted to make tonight by saying FTP myth or reality is there are so many people in my mind that have picked up from whatever source that FTP is the training metric that they should be using, that they've got it so stuck in their head that they're just blindfolded to almost anything else that's going on. And that, for me, is such a weakness. And, we use this example here of me on the floor, cyclist, triathlete, thinks more about their bike than they do about their body. And, this really just paints that picture of, you've got a bike and you spend anything from £2,000 to £15,000 on your bike to make it go faster. And you're so hung up about what's going on your bike that you overlook the important bit. Is actually you that sat on the bike, that's producing the power output, that's doing the work, that needs to be aero, that needs to be used to sitting in that position for 20 minutes to 5-6 hours. And if you're not used to that, then it doesn't matter how much money you spend on this piece of kit here if you don't look after the machine that's driving that piece of kit over there. And, and again, I've done another little tiny blog article that sort of, we look at things that you can put on your bike to make your bike go faster. We can reduce drag chain inefficiency by less than 1%. Well, drive chains are already 98% efficient. So, to improve its efficiency by 1% is you're saving 1 or 2 watts, but you're putting £1,000 pulley system on your bike. Well, that doesn't make sense when you're walking around. And in my case at the moment, I'm probably about 7 or 8 kilos over race weight. It's getting those priorities right. And so for me, tonight is you guys understanding what you need to be doing in terms of actually getting the most from your training. And so, do you understand the numbers? Do you understand what the numbers mean? Do you understand what the numbers are telling you? And so we sit and we start off and we say, well, are you training properly? And again, I'm skirting over a lot of this thing. I want to go through, I'd love to go through this hour upon hour of detail, but I'm skirting over a lot of this at the moment. For me, training is about a number of factors. The first one is making sure you're doing enough training volume. Now, adequate volume can be in both directions. It can be, am I training enough? Or actually can go to the other end of the spectrum. Am I training too much? And, I can see there's one of my clients on at the moment that, I'd probably say, we need to back down the hours. You don't need to be throwing in that extra 2-hour easy ride because it's enjoyable and you love it, because then it takes away from the issue down at the bottom, recovery. So, we've got to find that optimal curve for you about what is adequate volume. For some athletes, it's 4 or 5 hours a week. For other athletes, it's 15 to 20 hours a week. And it surprises people when I tell them that, I've done sub 10.5-hour Ironman on an average of 6 to 8 hours training a week. I've done sub 3-hour marathon, again, on average from 40 to 60 miles a week. When most people go, no, to go sub 3 hours, you've got to be running 70, 80 miles a week or more. No, you don't. It's about getting things right. And likewise, getting your duration right is absolutely crucial. There's no point in going out for a recovery run if it ends up being an hour, hour and a half. It might be really low intensity, but then that becomes no longer recovery. You've put too much energy drawn out of the system. There's effort gone into the body that's really not driving you forward. Then we've got intensity. And again, I've spoken at length about this in different places. And the crucial thing for me is training is about getting your intensity right, the intensity that's right for you for the session that you're doing. And if we get that intensity wrong, again, it's almost not worth doing the session. So that for me is the crux of it. And that's where people start getting hung up on this functional threshold power. Then we look at sports specificity. Again, I tend to mix around a bit, but if I'm a runner this season, 85-90% of my training will be running. If I'm a triathlete, I'll balance my training off. If I'm a cyclist, I ride my bike. I very rarely run. And again, the idea of, we're going through lockdown at the moment, I've got a bit more time, I'll go and do some running because I'm bored, or I'll go and do something else because I'm bored. I really, really worry about what impact that has, again, on the final issue of recovery. Paul Heggie's just posted a comment up, and I'm not sure if everybody sees it, but it's really appreciative. Paul, as he said, is I coached him for a 12-hour time trial, and the longest we did before the event was a 4-hour ride. He didn't need to be doing any more than that, because it's a mix of getting the volume right, getting the duration right, getting the intensity right, and getting the recovery right. And probably the one thing we might have lost out on, and we were doing a fair amount on the TT bike, that was probably the bit that he suffered on, was being in that position on the TT bike, after about 8-9 hours. But then, to be honest, you're not going to go out and do 8-9 hour training rides. There's another guy, I don't know if Dave Hathaway's on at the moment, but Dave's now done 2 double Ironmans, and we're just talking about doing his 3rd double Ironman later on in the season. There's an event that looks like he might still be on. He's given me the go-ahead that he's actually entered it today. Now, we're looking at he's racing for 26, 28 hours. We don't go and do training sessions that are more than 6 hours. You don't need to, if everything here is right. So the crucial thing is, and the crux of it is, it's actually not just about here, although that to me is the most important. It's about getting the balance of all these factors right. And I think that to me is really, really important. Is, do we get that intensity right? So, what we're trying to do, excuse me, is we need to make sure that intensity is sufficient. And the comment that I bring on here is that by making sure that our intensity is effective, we place an overload on the body which gets compensatory effect, which aids development of fitness and training. That sounds a bit mouthy. Hopefully the next pictorial slide will show you in a bit more scary detail, but then I can explain it a little bit more slowly. So we place an overload on the body, this element at the top. Now, if I'm used to doing this in a lecture environment, and I'll bounce around and hop around and do different things. And so the daft example I often give is that, if I decide I'm going to hop everywhere, the physical overload that I've placed on my system is on one leg only. Well, pretty soon that leg is going to become tired. Ultimately, it's going to become stressed. Potentially, going to become damaged. My ability to hop is then going to be reduced dramatically. Now, somehow, and we don't understand fully how this happens, but we've got a black box going on. So in this black box system, something goes on with the body, and the body now detects the stress and the damage that's taken place. And because of the stress and the damage, the body then repairs itself. So it changes the gene expression, it repairs itself. And as a result of sufficient recovery, we can monitor over time changes in both the cellular and the subcellular organization. So what does the cell look like? How much mitochondria is in there? How much muscle strength's in there? How much blood volume's in there? All of those things. System becomes adapted. And then at the bottom line is we then improve function. The crucial element here, though, is that this physical overload that we place on the body has a direct link into what function we're improving. So again, I want to pick up on, and it frightens me. So I look at sessions where people will go and do a 6-8 week FTP builder on Zwift, and all they're doing high intensity, or they're going out and doing HIIT training. And it's like, well, what you're going to get is very, very short-term build, because the physical overload that you're placing on the system is limited to one specific function, which is really quite a discrete, quite a small function. So we need to think about the bigger picture. So what we've got to look at is your training giving you the right overload for what you need to improve your function? Now, I'll take that into another pictorial here. And normally, again, I'd spend 10, 15 minutes going through this if I was in a lecture phase. And so I'm very aware of the time. I don't want to be here all night. I know you guys, time is precious. I can go through this with people in further detail and further slides if we want later on. But effectively, what we're looking at is we're looking at a model of overload. So if we look at this left-hand scale, we're talking about fitness, for the want of a better term. The ability to perform, the ability to undertake a task. If we then place an exercise load here at the start of this time, so we've got time on your horizontal axis, if we place a bout of exercise here, if that exercise is a low load, we can see we get a small drop-off in fitness, whereas if it's a much higher load here, we get a bigger drop-off in fitness. And again, I'll use that as an example. Let's say you're going to go out and ride for, I'm being naughty, I'm going to sit on my feet. Let's say you're going to go out and you're going to ride for, say, 5 miles. At the end of that 5 miles, your ability to perform, generally, I would say, is going to be down here. Unless, of course, you've gone out and you've ridden 5 miles as hard as you possibly can, in which case we've got a factor of intensity and duration that suddenly makes that a high load exercise. It might be that you're going to go out and ride 100 miles at a very, very low intensity, but because you're on your bike for 4, 5, 6 hours, that suddenly, although the intensity is low, the load function, and if you want to use a training peaks value, training stress score, how long I'm going for, or training impulse, a trim, so what my heart rate is doing for the duration, that, even though it's a very low intensity, becomes a high load session because you've been exercising for a long period of time. Now, again, I don't want to go into the intricacies of that, but effectively what I'm saying is, if we know that the session is a light session, that's what I was saying to you before about people get confused by doing a recovery session at a low intensity, but then do it for a long duration. It no longer is a low load training session. It becomes a higher load or a medium load training session. But effectively what I'm trying to say is that if we look at this factor here, from a low load session, if I do a session that doesn't place a great impact on my fitness, I will recover from that session pretty quickly. But the impact, the benefit of that session is fairly limited. And if I don't train again, I'll be back to baseline pretty quickly. If I do a much higher intensity session, now great, when I finish that session, I'm absolutely ruined. I've run out of glycogen, I'm probably dehydrated, I've possibly caused muscle damage. If you ask me to get back on the bike after I've been riding at time trial pace for 4 hours and said, go and ride another 4 hours, the chances are I'm going to tell you where to go. And that won't be very polite. So what we're looking at is that the impact on our fitness, the impact on our ability to perform a task, the impact on our ability to carry on riding, becomes more and more and more diminished. And I've lost my mouse, there is. With recovery time, with sufficient recovery time, we come back to baseline. If we allow the body to recover properly, we then see a massive peak from that session. And if we don't train again, that fitness level takes a longer time to drop off. So what we've got to look at is mixing high and low load sessions. Now, the problem I've got here, and I'll be completely blunt with you, is I can't tell you this scale either on a time scale or on a fitness scale or on a load intensity scale. And anyone that says they can is I'm trying to think of a polite term, sailing it down the river, because we really don't know. We can have an understanding, and what I tend to do with a lot of my athletes is I work and I look at what their heart rates are doing, I look at what powers are doing, I get feedback from them of how they're feeling, how their legs are feeling, and just try and get whole body responses rather than computer says. Computer says, Garmin says, oh, you've done a training session, it's going to take X hours to recover from it. No. We don't know how good your hydration is, how good your recovery nutrition is. We don't know whether you've been stretching. We don't know whether you're now going to climb ladders for the rest of the day or continue doing gardening for the next 8 hours. So we don't know. So that's the basic model that we've got to work towards. And then we look at taking things forward from here. So, I've spent quite a bit of time on this. Now, effectively what I'll be looking at, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this tonight. This is almost another hour in itself. From the next training session, we should be starting our next training session up here and getting that drop off and getting that rebound and getting that drop off and getting that rebound. And by doing that, over time, our fitness will be benefited. If we only get back to baseline before we try our next training session, all we're going to do is we're going to stagnate and we're going to stay at the same fitness forever. Worst case scenario, you start your next training session down here, that's going to happen, you're not going to recover, and you're going to find you're going to become overtrained, you're going to become ill, you're going to become injured. So it's really important that we look at getting this model of training overload right for you. And again, everybody is different in that scenario. The problem we've got is therefore it isn't just about going out and training harder. you can't just go and train harder. You can't just go and do more hours. If I do more hours, I'll get better. If I go and run, cycle, push harder, I will get better. That is, to me, the wrong scenario. It is about being a lot more focused and over that shoulder there. Train smarter, not harder. It's about knowing what you're doing in training. That really is where we're coming on to. So in the first instance, it's about understanding your metabolic profile. And, you know, back in the day, I used to be slim and thin and athletic and had some hair. Look, I got hair that day, not much more than I've got at the moment. But you get an idea of vintage just by looking at my Cervelo P2 that I was on at the time. So it's understanding that metabolic profile. And if we understand your metabolic profile, in my mind, we've got a far better understanding of your data than by looking at FTP. Now, again, I could spend, and I probably will, skip over this tonight, but you know, I've said to a lot of people, if they're interested, I will do another 45 minutes on, let's talk you through what this physiological profile means. Let's get you to understand this, you know, really clearly. Let's get you to see what happens with changes over time. Let's get you to understand different facets of your training. But effectively, all I want you to look at this evening is the blue line on here is your oxygen uptake, and the red line on here is your carbon dioxide production. And the green line, which I'm not bothered about for tonight, is your ventilation rate. So that's how much air that's going in and out. So oxygen uptake, how much oxygen is going into the lungs, into the blood, down to the muscle contracts, you go forward. And this is one typical bike profile that I use here. So for this athlete, I've built their workload up for 4.5, 5 minutes, leveled them off for 5 minutes, built them up for 1 minute, leveled them off for 5 minutes. Now, I can tell you this rider was an elite rider at the time, was riding for the Great Britain cyclocross team, as well as a UK pro-based team. And just to give you for some of you, just to make you upset, this was at 240 watts and this was at 320 watts. When I've got oxygen here above carbon dioxide, I know we've got fat burning going on. When I've got carbon dioxide, red, and oxygen on top of each other here, you are basically at a metabolic threshold. All your body is doing is burning carbohydrate. And again, I can see that going on here. And what I can now see is I can see how much fat burning is going on. I can see this metabolic threshold going on. I can see anaerobic capacity. So I've got a full profile for this particular rider, knowing that he was doing road races, knowing that he was doing elite and international crit races. So I can look at this and go, yeah, I can see what's wrong with this. Now, I don't want to go into what's right and what's wrong with this profile, but it allows me to get a much better understanding of an athlete's whole profile, right from endurance through threshold, up to peak, through recovery, looking at efficiency, looking at our economy, looking at fat metabolism, looking at carbohydrate metabolism, and seeing how that impacts on his whole body performance and what we need as facets for actually making sure that we get the training tasks right for the elements and for the races that he's doing. So go all the way back to that cyclist on the floor and the bike on the bed. If you don't get this right, you don't get your training right, you'll just pick a plan that's an artificially generated plan from Training Peaks or Zwift or Strava or wherever you're going to buy your plan from, Trainer Road or all those places out there. It's a generic plan. It's not right for you. It doesn't look at your strengths and weaknesses. It doesn't get your training zones accurately enough. So that, for me, is the problem that we're facing. Now, again, I'll go into, I want to go into this in more detail on another day because I'm already aware that I've been blabbering on for 25 minutes and I want to go through some really important stuff coming up soon. I'll flick back to this just very briefly. If we look at the max test, blue line in here, we've got a lovely linear increase in the oxygen uptake, and this is what I'd expect to see, regardless of whether you're an international level athlete or, Joe Public that rides your bike 10 miles a week. And what we can also see in here is I can see where these two lines cross over, and I've got threshold from that. What we're looking at, and you can just about see in the back of my slide, I haven't made it probably quite strong enough in here. VO2, oxygen uptake. We've got the scale there on the vertical axis. We've got power on the horizontal axis. And what we're seeing is we're seeing a linear increase there in what's going on. So if I just flick back that slide again, we've got is that nice linear increase in what's going on there. And if I try and do this, I might be able to, no, can't do that. I'm just going to try and be clever and put a pen marker on it. I'll go down there. So your oxygen use increases because of an increasing demand from the working muscle to produce power output. Oxygen needs to be delivered to the muscle to produce the power to burn the fuel for you to go forward. Simple as. So next stage there is, well, We can use heart rate as well. Hang on, heart rate's a lot more simple, complex than power output, doesn't cost as much. Maybe there's some problems with it, but what we've also got, and if I look at the heart rate response on the graph that we've just shown you, again, we've got heart rate versus oxygen uptake. And what we see is we also see a very linear response. Heart rate and oxygen uptake are also related. And this is a factor that most people overlook when they're talking power. And it's like, power's the be all and the end all. No, it's not. It should be used in combination. And we'll tell you why in a second. As more oxygen is needed to supply the increased power demands, the heart has to pump faster to deliver that oxygenated blood. So what we effectively end up with is we end up with a relationship very similar to this, where we see, or should see, a very sort of fairly linear relationship between heart rate and power output. Now, that's not on an instantaneous basis, but it's on a whole body basis. And I got a whole load of data from the Australians where, I looked at Stu O'Brady, I looked at Cadell Evans, I looked at a whole load of the Australian national squad, and I looked at the heart rate data and their power data from a 7-day or 6-day tour stage race. And I've got all of this, and I'd love to go on to that on another day, and I might well do. But what we know is there is this linear relationship going on. And by using that data, we can now start to say, right, well, what's going on in terms of training zones? So, we can look at a power zone here that says, right, for this heart rate here, if we scroll across vertically here, horizontally here to look at the vertical axis, the heart rate, we've now got a heart rate zone up here that corresponds to the top end power zone, which I'm saying to use your maximal speed power training, sprint work. Type 2 fibers, fast twitch, glycolytic fibers. Come down a zone. We're now looking at this threshold zone. Now, for me, this threshold zone is your type 2A fibers, your fast twitch oxidative fibers. Now, again, I'm skimming over this today. I'd love to go into this in more detail if you want to come and join me for another evening. This tells us all about our threshold zone. Now, what I'm able to do from the metabolic testing is I'm able to see where that zone accurately sits. So rather than going, let's stick a finger in the air and let's guess, we can actually, through the lab testing, tell you where this cutoff point happens between your threshold training and you go fully anaerobic. So we've got a zone here that corresponds to a power zone if you want to use it, a power zone if you want to use it, and a heart rate zone if you want to use it, and a heart rate zone if you want to use it. Now, there's a zone I miss out here, and then we come down to our endurance training. So again, we've got a heart rate zone that will come off here, and we've got a power zone that would come off here. And so what we're looking at, that is our endurance training, and that's now our slow twitch oxidative fibers. So we can clearly see we've got recovery work down here, we've got endurance work here, and then with the fast twitch fibers up here, we've got threshold work, and we've got maximal power work. So we've got the whole spectrum of what's absolutely going on in terms of your different training zones. So again, I'm looking at a spectrum approach here as opposed to a single data point approach from a functional threshold power. And again, I keep alluding to functional threshold power. I've not blitzed it apart yet, and I don't intend to. It can serve as a good measure for people, but I think it's more myth than reality. And I then use that to say, well, how effective is your training? And this to get the performance you need, it's about how effective your training is. So there's this example here, I've got a rider that's done a 2-hour ride. I've highlighted 100 minutes of the ride, and I've looked at what's going on in the heart rate response. I haven't got a power on this athlete. It's quite old data. And I've looked at what's going on here, and then we've looked at this and gone, flipping heck. This athlete should have been heart rate 150, 160. They've only spent 25% of their training time in the right zone. So if we put that in the real world and we think an athlete is doing, let's make the maths easy. If an athlete is doing 6 hours of training a week and they're only 25% of their training time in the right zone, well, they might as only well be doing an hour and a half of training. So it's a crazy amount of time that's wasted if you're not training in a focused fashion. So that brings me on to how I would look at effective training setup. And I'd set an athlete a target zone, and I would like them to be in that target zone as best as they can. You can see this is a road ride. The guy's speed profile here is in blue, and the speeds are all over the place. Again, I don't have a power on here, but we can also see the altitude. So the guy's climbing and descending and climbing and descending. You can see how his speed profile's varying, but he's kept his heart rate nice and controlled. And same athlete, now 150 to 160, is 80% of the time in the training zone. So again, 6 hours of effective training on the bike, he's got 5 hours that's now effective. So for the guy that was only 25% of the training time to be getting his training as effective as this chap, they've got to be on the bike for 20 hours a week. Because if this guy's doing 6 hours and he's got 5 hours of effective time, the other guy's only doing, 25% of effective training, he's got to be doing 20 hours a week, which then means you don't get the recovery time, you don't get the focus, you're then overloaded, you've got to put in more nutrition, you're more likely to break down, you're more likely to get ill, you're more likely to be injured. So this isn't now about FTP, this is about making sure your training is in the right zone. And again, that's another massive, massive element in itself. I've got an itchy nose, I have got a tissue somewhere, but no, can't see it. So really what I'm saying is ride smarter, not harder. The focus is smarten up your training. Keep really disciplined in what you're trying to do. And again, this is where people come back to me and go, but I use my functional threshold power. Okay, great. Let's look at it. Why are we going to use heart rate monitor and power meter? Well, the first thing is making sure your training is at the right intensity. If we can get your training load appropriately, correctly, then we're going to get the responses and the results that we need you to see. It's about feedback during performance. So am I training too hard? Am I training too easy? Am I hydrating well? Am I feeding well? And actually, it then can act as an early warning system as well. And again, I won't go into any of these, but illness, overtraining, hydration, nutrition, and heart rate power profiles can tell me a whole lot of things about what an athlete is doing, whether an athlete's recovering, whether an athlete is responding. And using this information is absolutely vital. But there are problems, and I'm very, very aware there are problems. There are problems with heart rate, there are problems with power. And this is really what I wanted to get onto tonight about, just not necessarily debunking the FTP idea, but actually saying, can you use something that's more effective? So heart rate, we all know it. Heart rate's affected by heat. If you're in a hot environment, boom, heart rate goes through the roof because you're effectively trying to cool the body and you've got to shunt more blood to the skin. So we can't be 100% reliant on heart rate the whole time. But if you live in a fairly normal environment, a fairly stable temperature, the guys in Nigeria have a nightmare, and I know there's a few of them on here tonight, because it's bloody warm. But at least it's bloody warm all the time. It's not like they're training at 6 o'clock in the morning and it's 4 degrees temperature, and they're training at 4 degrees at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It's now 36. They've got a window most year round between 24, 26 degrees up to about 34 degrees. So they've got a 10 degree window. We probably in the UK have got worse conditions than that with a bigger variation. But you go out in the cold, you can wrap up sensibly. You go out on a hot day, it's about making sure you've got the right clothing on, or you're exercising indoors. It's about making sure you've got the right cooling over you as best as possible. Dehydration. If you're not looking after your hydration, heart rate will be through the roof. Now, I don't use that as a negative. I use that as are you checking your hydration rate is appropriate? Because if your heart rate is drifting up for a training session, the chances are you're either overheating or dehydrating. So use it as a feedback mechanism. Nothing we can do about this one, but often with an adrenaline situation, so if you're on the start line of a race and your heart rate's absolutely buzzing, there's nothing much that we can do. But as the race goes on, as the gun starts, it will generally settle down. But as you'll see in a little while, I'll generally say to athletes, I wouldn't use heart rate as a mechanism for racing with. So there are downsides. And again, if you're fatigued, you will often struggle to elevate your heart rate. So that's something that we need to be very, very aware of. You're struggling to get your heart rate up. Should I be training? Should I be taking it easy? Why is my heart rate not going up? What have I done over the last few days? Have I eaten properly? Have I drunk properly? Have I slept properly? And so on and so forth. Ooh. But the crucial one is your heart rate doesn't give you an instantaneous response to the stress that you're placing on it. So as that little hill comes, you think, I'm going to go sprinting up that. Boom. Heart rate doesn't go flying up the roof, up through the roof in the same way that power does. There's a time lag. So you've got to be sensible about it. You've got to be aware of trying to keep it, a lid on it to get the best from your heart rate response. Now, but it's a great indicator of whole body metabolic strength. If you're keeping a steady intensity, if we're doing lower intensity work, it's a massive, massive key to giving us the right responses to what's going on with the body. And so for me, heart rate, certainly for your lower intensity work, your endurance work, is an ideal training metric. And it can be used effectively in your threshold work as well if you need it to. Now, functional threshold power, and I don't want to spend a whole load of time going through this. Now, there's a really great blog here by one of my former students, Mark Talon. Mark has puts a whole load of blogs out. So if you look for Mark Talon, phd.com, And he's, if you, in fact, Google Mark Talon FTP, and you'll come through to this link here. And it's really interesting. Mark's, put a whole load of stuff out, a lot more scientific than I'm talking about tonight. There's a whole load of scientific references if you want to go and read into it in any great depth. And it's quite amusing because Andy Coggan had picked up on it, and, Coggan's meant to be, and Coggan's comment to this is, as I've pointed out in your presentations, posts, etc., the 95% of 20-minute power is a rule of thumb for estimating FTP is Hunter's approach, not mine, despite the fact that I think training and racing with a power meter, it was all over there. But, and if you look on, Training Peaks, if you look on Zwift, if you look on Trainer Road, there are so many different mechanisms for going and doing a 20-minute power test. And I think in training racing with a power meter, there are 7 different approaches to estimating or calculating your FTP. So I don't want to go there. But if Andy Coggan is telling us that it's an appropriate correction factor to use, but there is lots of variation between individuals, and therefore Andy Coggan prefers to use alternate approaches to FTP. That to me suggests that FTP is probably not the way to go with an athlete. However, the problem I've got is that from all the years of testing that I've done, and where I've got that whole metabolic profile, and at this point I should stick up my little graph again, is I'm looking at endurance, I'm looking at threshold, I'm looking at peak, and I'm looking at recovery. And quite often I see where I'm seeing that crossover point occurring, where I'm seeing a metabolic threshold occur, which is where the body's shut down all its fat burning before it's gone fully anaerobic. That often doesn't coincide with a functional threshold pattern. Now, for 50, 60% of athletes, it does. You go, great, this is fantastic. But for 40%, 50% of people, it doesn't. You're looking at being, oh, crikey. What you think your functional threshold power is and what your metabolic threshold is are 2 different factors. And then if we're using functional threshold power to then reference back to our other lower intensity training zones, if you've got someone that's got a very, very low slope of the curve and you come back a certain number of watts, they can still be, because they're not metabolizing fat very well, they're actually not an endurance intensity, despite the fact that they're 40, 50 watts lower than where their functional threshold power is. Now, the metrics say, oh, that's great. But actually, if they've got a very flat slope and they're not metabolizing fat because they don't have a good enough endurance, all of their base training is done at an intensity that's far, far too high, and they're training at the incorrect zone. If they've got a slope that goes massively like that, and you step down 30, 40, 50 watts, now actually they're not even driving the endurance system enough. So the problem you've got here is effectively you've got a one data point method of providing with all your training zones. So the issue that I've got is that it's not that we've got 40 different ways of calculating FTP, and do we use 95% of 20-minute power, or do you go and do an hour's test, or there are so many metrics to actually calculate a functional threshold power. It's not that. My problem I've got is that you are relying on one single data point to give you the whole spectrum of what you need to be doing for training intensities. Now, if all you're going to do is go and ride 10-mile time trials, the functional threshold power of what I can ride, what power I can produce for 20 minutes is probably not bad, apart from when we're trying to then work back here and do our endurance work. When we're trying to step up and do our power work, again, but most of your training, 80% of your training in race season should be here. So if those zones are incorrect, or that zone's incorrect, it's not a huge great problem. But if I'm looking at athletes working across the spectrum that needs a decent endurance because they're a sportive rider or a road racer or a mountain biker, but also needs a good threshold power because they're climbing and racing and wants to sprint at the top end as well, that single data point approach isn't going to work for me. And that, for me, is the major issue that I have with functional threshold power. That's the key problem I've got. The next problem I find is that most athletes, I'm laughing at this point here, if you're all live in front of me, and you can chuck on comments on the web chat if you want to. At this point here, I usually stick your hands up and go, how many people know their FTP? And you get, 50, 60% of the room sticks their hand up and go, right, okay. So how many have reassessed their FTP in the last 6 weeks? And probably 40% of those hands go down. Okay. And you just suddenly go, guys, you aren't reassessing your functional, your training zones with functional threshold power enough. Again, I would suggest with heart rate, what I'm seeing with an athlete that's got a good training base, once we've determined those training zones, your heart rate zones don't change that much. They might bounce around 3 or 4 beats, but it's not like we're seeing an improvement. And I don't know if he's on, and I won't name call him tonight, but there was one of the guys that had come to see me, a month or two before Christmas. I think it was October time, and then he came to see me January, February, just before we shut down. I think he was one of the last athletes in before everything shut down, and he'd already noticed in training, and his metabolic threshold gone up by nearly 50 watts. And he'd noticed it in training. He was doing his steady endurance rides, and he was already producing 30, 40 watts more after 8 weeks worth of training. Got himself a bit ill over Christmas for one reason or another, and then started to pick it up again. But that's a massive gain in power output as a steady ride. But if you're not changing and you're not reevaluating your functional threshold power, you're in a nightmare. And if I look at the nightmare scenario that I get with things like training peaks, is you set your functional threshold power in training peaks, that's great. It will keep taking it up. As you improve it, it will keep saying push it up. But then when you've lost a bit of fitness, it won't say, oh, you need to bring down your functional threshold power by 20 or 30 or 50 watts. It will still have you training at that very, very high functional threshold power. So, you've gone away and you've had 2-3 weeks off the bike with illness or injury or, just family stuff or whatever, and you've lost a little bit of fitness, training peaks won't go, oh, we need to back that down. Whereas you jump on your bike, your heart rate will be through the roof. So you have to slow down. So your heart rate is a much better indicator of what your body is doing, in my mind. And that's one of the problems I've got with functional threshold power. Also, your power zones don't highlight fatigue and illness, and therefore may lead to early onset of overtraining. So again, I've got this issue of an athlete's got a functional threshold power in mind. Where are we now? We're May now. Oh, did my FTP test back in September. Oh, I don't like doing those. They hurt. And they're still using data from, 9 months ago. And they're still trying to hit 300 watts when they were flying at the end of the season. And they're overcooking themselves, and they're constantly overcooking themselves. And that's when we find an athlete gets ill, injured, overtrained. So again, it's being aware that we've got to look at these zones being flexible. So those are issues that I've got with using functional threshold power to determine your training zones. But I've said there's problems with heart rate as well. So for me, what's best for training? Well, heart rate for me is usually adequate for training, but might be misleading for racing. And again, depends on the racing you're doing. If you're in a road race, you don't go, oh, slow down, boys, my heart rate's going through the roof. You go with the race. So you probably wouldn't want to use it in a race. Depends on what sort of event you're doing. Power provides a great objective marker for pacing and climbing and solo events. But if it's used in isolation in training, it is too static. You have to be measured regularly, or more important, looked at in combination with heart rate. So for most of my athletes that I work with, I will look at doing the majority of their work as being endurance-based, and then some of their sessions, if they've got power, as being power-based sessions, so that we're using both. But the metrics I've set for those training zones are metrics that are based upon what their whole physiological profile is doing, as opposed to one single data point. Now, there are times, and again, I don't know if the athlete's on this evening, but I've got a guy in Spain that I've never met, and I've had to use, because I haven't been able to do a physiological profile with him, I've had to use an FTP. It's given us a starting point, but then I've assessed it as looking at more of critical power, because we've done a 20-minute test, but we've done an hour up a mountain, we've done a 4-hour ride, and we've done some short sprint work. And from that, I can get an idea of what his profile is. So it doesn't mean that because we're in lockdown at the moment, I can't start out working with someone and give them some basis, but I like to have that true metabolic understanding of what you're doing. And it doesn't matter whether you're racing a 10-mile time trial or looking at a 12-hour time trial or road racing or doing Ironman triathlon, having that whole profile gives us so much more detail and depth and definition. When we're looking at power and heart rate, we ask what's best for racing. Well, it's event dependent. So time trials, sportives, triathlons, where it's pacing and it's focused and it's trying to stay within yourself, well, power is beneficial, especially if you're on longer climbs or longer races. Heart rate can be okay and can be used quite sensibly if it's used with caution and being aware of adrenaline and all those sort of things. If you're road racing, well, forget it. You race on field, you race on what everyone else has got to say. Maybe just stick, if you've got a question, stick something in chat and I will try and answer it in chat. So, thinking about cycling performance, I'm doing quite well. I'm on 46 minutes. How do we improve your cycling performance? Again, I went over a lot of this in the last presentation I did a fortnight ago. We should be looking at what your physiological needs are, what your event needs are. If we know what your physiology is and we know what you need to achieve for your events, then we can target that. And then we set those objective goals. We need to improve your endurance. We need to improve your threshold. You need to do X sessions of such and such a week. This is where we need to be. We need to reduce your body weight, whatever it might be. We get those needs, we set those targets, we set those goals. And then we can look at the adaptations that you need with specific training. And for me, that training should be not just we're going to pluck an FTP value out of the sky. And is it reliable? Is it not reliable? Are we measuring it enough? Is it giving us what we need? We need to really look at that whole spectrum of performance. And once we know that spectrum of performance, or we've used it in combination with other things, we can then target the training you require with specific training to get the right adaptations. I hope you can't hear the dogs are snoring down here. I hope I'm not boring you in the same way. From there, I design a training plan, training regimen that's got overload and recovery that's both interesting and challenging. That's the crucial bit. And then I ideally would use, I'm going to stop here. Ideally, I would then look at objectively evaluating your progress. So in an ideal world, if we're testing again, I'd try and get an athlete into the lab every 3 to 6 months. Or at least look at what's going on. If I'm coaching them, I can look at heart rates and power profiles and what's going on an ongoing basis to make sure that they're going in the right direction. So over to what we can do for you. Mark's put something up. I'll come on to that in a second. Training book, if you've not got one, you can buy one through the website. I've got a few in stock at the moment. Physiological testing now, with the way things are at the moment, obviously can't test. But we can start hopefully testing from early July if we're following the lead of the hairdressers, etc. I'm hoping come the 6th of July that the restrictions will be limited. So we're about 8 weeks away before testing can take place. I can do a little bit at distance, but give me a shout on that one if we need to. Training program design, of course, I can help you with that. And obviously I coach quite a few athletes out there and coach them specific to their needs. So these are all the things that we're able to do with you at the moment. And thank you. Hopefully you enjoyed that. There's some questions coming through and some comments coming through already. I will be a little bit cheeky. We've obviously not asked anyone for any form of payment for this evening because I quite enjoy doing them. But if you do fancy supporting me, you can obviously go to our website and buy a gift voucher for a test, which would be great to show your commitment. You're ready to come in and get tested whenever it's ready. Or if you just want to say a little thanks and aren't ready for testing yet, head to coffee, that's ko.fi.com/sportstest and buy me a coffee because that'd be really appreciated. Right, okay. Mike, thank you. No problems at all. Thank you for attending. Keith, good to see you on board. Right, let's have a look. Provide some information on limitation. So these are flying through now. I want to just highlight this if I can. So Mark said, provide some oh, right, okay. I'm just going to try and, sorry, I need to move this chat window. Right, okay, so the problem with, Mark's pointed out really nicely. So certainly when I've got people like Keith on board that's, racing Ironman distance, one of the problems with functional threshold power is that it effectively, what it does is at your threshold, which is, it, in a simplest term, is a power that you should be able to sustain for an hour or close to an hour. At that point, I would expect you to be burning purely carbohydrates. When you're holding a certain percentage of that, whether it's 70%, 65, 85% of that, we have got no understanding of what your oxidation rates are doing. So what that's telling me is I've got no understanding how much fat burning is going on, how much carbohydrate burning is going on. And if you're a certain size individual, 80 kilos in my case, I know as an 80 kilo individual with about 10, 12% body fat, I've probably got 400 or 500 grams of carbohydrate stored on board. Now that threshold, I'm going to be burning that at the rate of about 5 or 6 grams per minute. So I've got 100 minutes of exercise. It means I can do probably a 50-mile time trial before I run out. But it gives me no understanding of if I'm 85% of that, what's going on and what dietary adaptations, what training adaptations I can have to ensure that if I'm going to go and do a long sportif, if I'm going to go and do an Ironman race, even if I'm in a standard Olympic distance triathlon, how much glycogen I'm going to have left as I climb off the bike. And so having that complete metabolic profile gives me a lot more detail in terms of, say, of fat metabolism, carbohydrate metabolism, and everything that's going on, and then how we can change the diet at the right intensity to ensure that we get the right things going on. IV sweet spot is probably a lot more what I would class for me as being somewhere between threshold and endurance work. So it's not out and out threshold work, which is where we're really focusing on the climbing work. But it's not that steady endurance where we can have that good conversation going. But it's somewhere in the middle. Now, from a metabolic point of view, I find that's much more of a mixed muscle. And it's good that you train in that zone infrequently. But that, for me, is how I would structure your unstructured rides. So that, for me, is where you've got a ride that says, right, go out, ride with the boys, ride with the pros, sit on the back wheel, hold it, and toast yourself for an hour to 4 hours. And it's doing it slightly differently. So it's making sure that, and as I say, tonight I've just sort of wanted to really focus on, and I've used FTP as the draw because I think there are a lot of people that got hung up on FTP and using FTP and using power to train with, but they don't understand why. And it's just that, they've gone and bought a power meter and they bought, training and racing with a power meters book, or they've heard that this is, but they then throw their heart rate monitor away and they've got no idea what's going on with their body and they're losing a lot of information. I've not gone into tonight how to set up a training plan. I think that falls into that category just that little bit more. Let me just flick through a few more of the comments on here. So I'm trying to, there we go. Bill, I do metabolic carb testing. The system I use is a Schiller system, which is a German-Swiss system, all breath by breath, and it's the same system as, I'm just trying to think where they had the Swiss Olympic Institute have them, but it's a medical grade system. So yes, I do metabolic testing. So as soon as we are up and running, hopefully back in early July, I will be able to get you in. So if you're interested, you can head over to the website, sportstest.co.uk. Hopefully, Joe, if Joe's online at the moment, I'll get some messages pinging through. Hopefully, there's a link somewhere. Oh, there you go. Joe sent a link for the gift vouchers. Thank you, Joe. So hopefully, if you're online now, you'll be able to click onto that. Tonya, great stuff. Yes, there's a gap between that anaerobic and that threshold zones, my heart rate graph. I didn't elaborate because I didn't want to go into it in too much detail. So what I would say to you there, and this is another discussion all in itself, but just really briefly, is that what we've got is at the lower intensity, the recovery zone and the endurance zone, it's all about aerobic slow twitch muscle fiber. Then we've got a gap that we miss, which I think Ivy was alluding to, which a lot of people call sweet spot. And then we move into the threshold and the maximal power work. And the threshold and the maximal power work that's very much fast twitch fiber. And the endurance and recovery zone down here, or base zone down here, is very much slow twitch fiber. So we've got two different elements that are going on. In the middle is what I call mixed muscle. And what you've got is you don't suddenly stop using slow twitch and suddenly start using fast twitch. You've got this crossover zone here. So although you can't see me, you've got this crossover zone. If I don't want to stop the share, but maybe if I just pause the share for a minute, does that, I don't know if you can see me all in big detail now. So you've got this zone that's going on here, which is in the middle, and I call that mixed muscle. Now, the problem is you're not focusing either on endurance or either on the peak, but you've got this crossover that's going on. And so I tend to avoid that, but that's what you will do, where I set you an unstructured session, where it's about you going out and enjoying your training. You will spend a lot more time in that mixed muscle zone. You'll spend a lot more time in that sweet spot where you're bouncing between the two. The problem is if we spend too much in that zone there, you're neither doing one thing nor the other. It's like, and I use a bit of a daft example, and it's like me having a secretary and saying, right, as I come in first thing in the morning, there's a pile of filing that needs doing there, and there's a pile of invoices that need following up there, there's a pile of appointments that need following up there. And after 5 minutes that she'd been onto the filing, she then, she does file 3 things, and she starts flicking through here and starts working over there, and then is making me a cup of tea and, bouncing around, not focused on anything. So it's really, really key that we look at using that gap, and we look at using that gap really effectively. Mike, power meters for running, I'm still not convinced. I probably need to talk to somebody that's a bit younger than I am, but I don't know if Mark Talon's still on board. I'm not convinced, and I was always told, and I was always taught, and maybe things have moved on, you cannot assess power. It's an estimation, on a running shoe. It is an estimation of what's going on rather than a pure power. And so for that reason, what I would look at is, as a runner or a triathlete, I will use pace. So again, I've got this on here, and I use pace for what's going on in my training sessions. Now, the problem we've got, and if we look at, power stroke, pace stroke, whatever, if you're on a flat, smooth road, we can get some really sensible data. If you're running around a track, 400-meter track, we can get some really smooth data. As soon as you start going off-road, what you're doing just goes rocketing off or one way or the other, which again is when I really rely on heart rate. So I will look at my pace, and I'll look at pace as akin to being my power on the bike, but I will look at what my heart rate is. And for me, for my steady work or even my interval work, but mostly I'm looking at heart rate, and more of my interval work I'll move towards doing on a flatter section of road or the track, and I'll look at pace for those. So that would be my akin to looking to power output. Hopefully that helps there. Jeff, great session. Back to your early graph. How can you tell when you pick up optimal to train build? You can't, Jeff. Yeah. And I'm really being, you can't, sorry. It's trial and error. It's finding for me as a physiologist, with you as the athlete, what works for you. And as I said, and I alluded to it really briefly, if I could tell you where that optimal peak was before you started to drop down again, if I knew where that optimal peak was, I would either be incredibly rich, or every other bugger would also be able to tell you. And it's through trial and error that we find out. We do a training session, we see how the athlete's responding, we see, how they're feeling, what the legs are doing. So for me, a lot of what I get from my athletes, and I'll tell you the secret now, the secret I get from my athletes isn't about what I see coming back on, on their training peaks or sport tracks or, Exhale, whatever system they use that tells me whether they've met and what training stress scores are, this, that, and the other. The biggest thing I get is the comment that they put at the end of their training session. I've got tired legs, I was feeling good. It's like, so that gives me the marker of, right, this athlete is improving. No, they're not improving. Right, what am I doing with them the next couple of days? What am I doing with them next week to make sure we've constantly got that build that we need? And again, I have that discourse with all of the guys that I coach that say, you run into a problem, I want to know straight away. I don't want you to wait until the following week or 3-4 days time that you've not been able to do a session for whatever reason. I need to know about it now so that we can build you in the appropriate way. And that for me is what coaching is about. And though again, going back to, I've got, to be honest, I've got plans on training peaks. I have to, because that's part of the business. But that is not coaching. That's just throwing something into the ether. And a poor plan is better than no plan whatsoever. But if you want to perform, and you want to perform at your peak, you need to hook up with a coach that gets to know you. And, I'm not going to say who or where or why, but I've had people on here who I've been coaching, and for some of them I'm still coaching, but I've known that they're leaving their partner before their partner has. I know they're having problems at work before before their other significant other does, because that's what a coach needs to be. That coach needs to be that sounding board of, yes, it's going well, no, it's not going well. And that, I think, is where I separate myself away. Now, I know that's going off a bit on track on the question you've asked, but the only way to do it, in my mind, and I'm sure in time there'll be some artificial intelligence out there that goes and builds and tells us these things. But crucially, it's about you understanding your body, the physiologist understanding your body, the physiologist having an understanding of what they need, and then it's tying those two up to find out what works best for you. Because again, in that optimal peak, it's affected by so many things. It's affected by sleep, it's affected by stress, it's affected by nutrition, it's affected by cool down, it's affected by warm up. There are so many factors that this won't tell you. And that's the problem that we run into. I've just had a message on my phone. No, that's fine. It's all right. It's just people saying thank you. That's fine. Any more questions? Yeah, great stuff, Bill. Appreciate that. Just want to check that there aren't any more questions coming through. I'm doing these on the web chat, whereas I think sometimes questions come through somewhere else. So, Joe, if you're online and I've missed any questions, question and answers, there's 3 in here, Gordon. Thank you. Got to water the garden. No. If you've got any rainwater spare, Gordon, my wife is after rainwater. Very important for the garden. So that's fine. Answered that one live. Andy McGill, Andrew, cheers for the explanation. Great evening. Yeah, I hope you all enjoyed it. Not a problem at all. Would I completely discount a 20-minute power test, Dan? Yeah, 95% correlation factor is unreliable. Yes, I would do. You know, it's a difficult one. I think at some point you're in a situation that you've got to use whatever metrics that you've got, and if it gives you something that you can benchmark to and you're going to do it effectively, and knowing that you're doing, and it's difficult because someone just say no, you're doing mostly sprint triathlon. You know, that 20-minute test is close to going out and riding a 20k bike time trial, but sprint triathlon in Jersey means you're going and riding a 40-odd k time trial. So it's a different one. It's you know, I'd probably say it's an objective marker, but I wouldn't hang the whole of your training strength success and failure on looking at a 20-minute power test. So hopefully that helps you out. Good stuff, Smithy. So just having a few comments coming through. Thanks, Martin. Good to see you. Ed and Izzy, Steve, great stuff. Thanks, everyone, guys. Oh, nice, Mark, to see you. Really appreciate you turning up, and it'd be great to see you later in the year. Richard Sheldrake, never got on with chest heart rate monitor. Any tips for a comfortable one? I go through different phases. The polar straps, and I don't think I've got one lying around, the polar straps that are really, really, really flexible, Richard, I get on quite well with. They're not plastic, they're a lot more material. So I find they don't rub in the same way. From the same principle at the moment, I have got a ticker strap, which I use quite happily. And I know in the past, Becky's always had a problem with the Garmin straps, particularly the hard Garmin straps, because they tend to rub her. She finds the ticker strap no problems at all, so that works well for her. And I'd say it's trying, and it's trying various things. I'll show you my wrist though, and this gives you an understanding. I wear my watch, and I don't know how well you can see that, but I wear my watch really tight, and you can see it leaves an indent on both the front of my arm. And of course, it's got this flickering away and measuring the whole time. So I think it's okay for steady state work. It's got its limitations for fast changes in pace. But again, it's a start that if you take with a pinch of salt, it will give you some useful information better than having no information and no feedback whatsoever. So, a wrist-based or an arm-based might be a way to go, but they're not as reliable as looking as that chest strap. Smithy, Martin, we've got that. Dave Hathaway, thanks. Nigel, good to see you again. It would be nice to see you. Yeah, it's finding the balance and finding what works for you. Claire, great, thank you very much. Right, okay, yeah, see what you get with your Fenix, Rich. Good stuff. Well, everyone, we've gone for an hour and 5 minutes. Hopefully, it seems like the comments have all been great and everyone's found that really worthwhile. Dan, great information. Thank you very much. Appreciate that, everyone. I'll rattle my tin once more before I go. So if you've enjoyed it, pop along to link down at the bottom here, ko-fi.com/sportstest. Really appreciate that. And sorry, something's flashing at me there now. I don't know what's flashing at me. I'll just ignore it. More comments, perhaps, more chat comments. Yes. So, pop along to coffee.com/sportstest and support me. I will probably be back in a fortnight if you guys have all found this valuable. If there's a topic you'd like me to talk about in a fortnight, if you want me to go through, I'll probably wait on the explanation of metabolic stuff until we get to just before we start testing, so it's fresh in people's minds. But I enjoyed doing them. If you'd like me to, it would be great to see you. And again, Joe has in the chat area just reposted the link for the gift vouchers. So you can buy a gift voucher for you or anyone else, right from the value of about £50 towards a test, right through to as much as you want to spend with me. And it will be great to see you all. And thank you all very, very much for attending. If I stop this now and, where have I gone? Hopefully I'm still there. And no, where have I gone? Let's go. There we go. Yes, so hopefully you can see me there. So thank you very, very much all for attending. I've really enjoyed it. And this will be posted on, my brain's gone completely, on YouTube within the next, hopefully, I'm going to put Joe on the spot here, within the next 24 to 72 hours. You will find links to it from the Sportstest Facebook pages, and we will email you all as attendees as well. So thank you very much for coming. Been great numbers along tonight, and hope you found it as valuable as the comments have suggested that most people have. So cheers guys, really, really enjoyed your time here. Bye now.